1722, North Yorkshire, England. A traveller's diary, half-burned, water-stained, its ink bleeding through the fragile pages, was unearthed from beneath a chapel floor during the restoration of an abandoned estate. Inside, a single entry had been preserved by the fire. Is greater than the bells have fallen silent. The air no longer carries the laughter of the living. We sealed them inside as they begged for forgiveness. No name, no date beyond the year, but it was signed with a peculiar mark, a crude carving of a serpent swallowing its own tail. For historians, this discovery began as a curiosity, but what they uncovered in the months that followed transformed a quaint legend into one of Britain's most disturbing historical mysteries, the disappearance of an entire village that had simply ceased to exist in 1722. There were no burial records, no Exodus documents, and no plague reports. Only one thing remained consistent in every recovered account: the village has vanished overnight. The Royal Historical Society would later describe it as an event deliberately erased from record. But that only raised one question. What happened in the forgotten village of 1722, and who wanted it to be buried forever? Imagine the English countryside in the early 18th century, cobblestone lanes twisting between gray hills, thatched cottages built with hands hardened by winter, and the soft toll of church bells marking the rhythm of daily life. At the time, Britain was shifting between superstition and reason. The Enlightenment was beginning to challenge the old world's belief in omens and curses. But in rural communities, far from London's scientific societies, fear still held power. Disease, famine, witch trials, and whispers of the unnatural defined existence for many. It was within this setting that the first trace of the village, known only as Ravensvale, emerged from obscurity. In 2019, an archaeological team restoring a 12th century chapel near Whitby discovered the charred diary fragment sealed under the floorboards. They initially assumed it to be debris from the Great Fire of 1788, but radiocarbon testing placed the ink at nearly 70 years earlier, circa 1722. The same chapel contained anomalies no architectural historian could explain. A hidden door leading nowhere, bricks reused from an older structure, and beneath the altar, a hollow cavity lined with scorched wood and ash. That was where the diary was found. At first, researchers thought they had stumbled upon remnants of a fire or plague quarantine, but the local archives revealed something much stranger. No record of any settlement named Ravensvale had ever existed in Yorkshire. No maps, no tax records, no land registries. An entire community had been erased. And then one name appeared again and again in unrelated sources. Reverend Elias Fenn, parish priest, 1718, 1722. Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what time is it there, because what you're about to hear isn't just a forgotten story. It's a piece of history someone tried very hard to destroy. Ravensvale, it seems, did not disappear because of disease or migration. It was removed methodically, ritually, and deliberately by its own people. To understand how such a disappearance could happen, we have to return to the early 1700s, when the British countryside was still fractured by poverty, religion, and isolation. Ravensvale, according to the scant evidence recovered, was a small agrarian village nestled near the moors, 20 or so families bound by blood and faith. The land was infertile, the winters long. Survival demanded unity, but it also demanded obedience. The parish was overseen by Reverend Elias Fenn, a man educated at Cambridge but dismissed after moral misconduct. Records show he was reassigned to a remote parish for penitence and reformation. He arrived in Ravensvale in 1718. By the accounts of nearby towns, he brought with him a strict theological obsession, one that blurred the line between faith and fanaticism. Within months, strange practices began to surface. Bells rang at midnight instead of dawn. Parishioners were forbidden from speaking certain Latin phrases during worship. Children were reportedly kept from school to attend purity rites. An archived letter from a clergyman in York dated March 1721 mentioned an infestation of moral hysteria in the northern parish under Reverend Fenn, where scripture is twisted into doctrine unknown to the Church of England. The bishop's response was brief: is greater than leave them. Some fires burned themselves out, but Ravensvale's fire would not extinguish itself. Months after the initial discovery, historians traced the burned diary to a traveling surveyor named Jonas Alder, who had been mapping trade routes between Whitby and Scarborough in the spring of 1722. His surviving notes, found separately in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, mention a peculiar detour. Is greater than stopped at a hamlet not on the map. Folk there was strange, silent, watchful. Church bell cracked, but still tolling. Met a Reverend Fenn. Declined to stay the night. The last entry in Alder's notebook was dated April 1722. He was never heard from again. Cross-referencing weather records showed a violent storm striking the moors that same week. It destroyed several smaller villages, but no one ever listed Ravensvale among them. Why? Because by the time the storm reached its peak, Ravensvale was already gone. Later excavation revealed layers of bone fragments under the chapel floor, arranged in deliberate circular patterns rather than graves. Many were from animals, dogs, sheep, but some appeared human. No official burial site, no markers, only symbols burned into the wood above, serpents coiling, hands clasped, eyes crossed out. Historians began to suspect Ravensvale had become a site of ritualistic isolation, a sect broken away from the church. But what could drive an entire village to such collective madness? The writings of Reverend Fenn, found years later in a sealed cabinet in London, offered a chilling clue. His private sermon drafts spoke of the cleansing of the corrupted flesh and the sound beneath the soil. Is greater than when the veil thins, he wrote. The righteous shall not flee from the earth, but the earth from them. Scholars initially dismissed it as the ravings of a zealot, until they realized his final sermon was dated April 14th, 1722, the same day Jonas Alder vanished. Local folklore preserved fragments of what might have happened next. Generations later, farmers in nearby hamlets told stories of hearing bells echoing from underground after heavy rain. Shepherds claimed that dogs refused to cross certain patches of moorland where the ground felt hollow, like something buried deep beneath. Even today, satellite imaging shows irregular sinkholes and subterranean cavities beneath the supposed location of Ravensvale, aligned in a perfect circle, 300 feet wide, the exact same diameter described in Fenn's final sermon as the Ring of Ascension. This is where the historical record ends and the silence begins. But in that silence lies the most haunting question of all. If Ravensvale truly vanished, what did its people believe they were escaping from? Was it famine, disease, or something much older, something the church feared to name? Because buried beneath centuries of moss and soil, under the stones that once held a chapel, lay evidence that the villagers had sealed themselves inside, and whatever they were hiding from never left. The discovery under the chapel floor was merely the opening note of a longer, darker melody that would take 2 centuries to resolve and another to truly understand. Scholars, antiquarians, and a succession of curious magistrates returned to the site again and again, each adding a thin layer of interpretation to a story that insisted on remaining slippery. By the mid-1800s, when Victorian antiquarians began cataloging parish records with an almost obsessive thoroughness, Ravensvale's absence was no longer a mere clerical omission. It became an anomaly to be corrected. A prominent local historian, Samuel Carow, wrote to the county archives in 1863, asking why no tithe records existed for any village in that quadrant of the moors. His reply, cold and bureaucratic, suggested clerical error. But in his private notebooks, Caro recorded something else. A charcoal drawing of the Ouroboros mark and a note that the parish register for 1722 had been sewn together and removed. He never published that entry. It was the persistence of one family descendants of the neighboring hamlet that kept the story alive. In 1891, an old woman named Martha Lyle, reputed locally as a midwife, whose memory stretched back into the early 1800s, offered testimony recorded in a county memoir. She described as a child being told never to cross a particular stretch of moor because a circle of stones eats the light. She recalled her grandmother murmuring about a great hush after a storm, the way dogs refused to enter the field. Those passing anecdotes seemed folkloric until physical evidence emerged. A probate record from 1723, misfiled and then rediscovered in 1902, which showed that a neighboring landowner, Thomas Harrow, had petitioned the county to take possession of a parcel of land described with such vagueness that later archivists assumed it a clerical shorthand. Harrow's name appeared again in a note from 1724, claiming he had cleansed part of the estate of public nuisance. The phrase was striking. Who had cleansed whom and of what? Archaeology provided the next breakthrough. In 1938, just before the war, excavators, opening a rodent-infested cellar on the supposed site of Ravensvale, uncovered a paved ring, ancient stone, laid in a precise circle, beneath which the soil had been compacted and burned black. Within the ring lay the fragmented bones previously mentioned, deliberately crushed and scattered, some bearing cut marks inconsistent with simple butchery. There were also fragments of textiles preserved by ash, small pieces of linen, dyed with a pigment that, upon analysis, was found to contain an unusual mineral not local to the region. It suggested trade or intervention from someone with means and knowledge. It was in these stones and ash that Reverend Elias Fenn's figure gained both definition and contradiction. Fenn's surviving letters, long thought to be sermon drafts, were catalogued in a private collection in London and made available to scholars in the 1970 seconds. The letters revealed that Fenn was both a man of theological rigor and of practical obsession. He wrote lovingly of the village's people, of their children, their toil, and their simple piety, but he also described a threat he called the sound beneath the soil, a phrase that recurred with increasing urgency. In one letter, he pleaded with a former tutor at Cambridge for ecclesiastical guidance, confessing that the congregation had come to him with complaints of headaches, voices in the night, and animals acting as if their bellies were full of lightning. He begged for counsel and for sanctions that might allow him to act without immediate episcopal interference. Historians were forced to ask whether the sound might have been metaphorical, an allegory for moral decay, or whether Fenn referred to a literal phenomenon. Geological surveys of the moor in the latter half of the 20th century complicated the matter. There were, beneath the chalk and peat, pockets of unstable strata and pockets of methane-prone clay, conditions that could, under certain circumstances, produce sudden subsurface noises and violent soil disturbances. Could a natural geologic menace have been misinterpreted as supernatural, catalyzing a community's descent into ritualized containment? Into this thicket of theory stepped a set of coded letters uncovered in the late 1990 seconds in a private estate sale. They were addressed to Reverend Fenn, but penned in an elegant cipher used by several learned societies of the time. Once decoded, they revealed the existence of a clandestine group calling itself the Order of the Veil, a coalition of minor gentry, clergy, and local magistrates who feared social contagion more than natural disaster. The order's rhetoric, as reconstructed from the letters, used language of purification and boundary. They spoke of sealing the ring and reconsecrating the earth if a parish failed to correct its corruption. There were payments recorded, discrete sums from landowners to a consultant in Whitby. The consultant's name was redacted. The letters suggested a chilling possibility. that a secret, extrajudicial authority had been operating in the margins, a body empowered by fear and by the social capital of those who could rewrite records and control narratives. If the order intervened, it could explain why official channels recorded nothing and why later generations found gaps instead of graves. More troubling were marginal notations indicating the order believed the threat could not be expelled in the ordinary way. It required containment. The phrase "to bind and hush" appeared repeatedly, sometimes accompanied by the Ouroboros mark. Witness testimonies from the early 19th century, when interpreted alongside the newly decoded letters, produced a portrait of increasing coercion. A descendant of Thomas Harrow, interviewed in 1820, reported that Harrow took counsel with his brother just before the spring of 1722, and that there were men who came at night with ropes and hoods. The narrative was impossible to corroborate from contemporary records because there were none, but when read with the archaeological evidence, it gained a terrible plausibility. And then there was the voice of the village itself, the closest thing to a whistleblower that the centuries would allow. In a damp chest in a London solicitor's vault, researchers found a tiny folded bundle, pages torn from a personal account soaked in brown but legible. They were written in the cramped, furious hand of a woman named Beatrice Lyle, likely a relative of Martha Lyle. Her entries describe days of increasing fear, livestock gone mad, children waking with sores, and Reverend Fenn's insistence that the community must act for its salvation. She described a meeting in the churchyard where men of rank argued for the closure of the village boundaries, sealing gates, and placing stones. She wrote, with a clarity that chilled later scholars, that the villagers had been given a choice to leave everything and walk into the moor, or to remain and be housed to the quiet. The last line, smudged by time, read, "We sang for sleep, and when the singing stopped, so did the waking." These fragments carried weight. They suggested that rather than fleeing, the villagers had been gathered, contained, and possibly killed as an act of social hygiene. Yet another set of queries complicated this bleak explanation. Some of the order's letters argued for alternatives: relocation, quarantine, exorcism, only to be overridden by those who prized land and property above life. The motive, when stripped of euphemism, was a mixture of paternalistic fear, property acquisition, and a theological conviction that certain impurities must be excised to preserve the whole. As evidence accumulated, so did objections. Skeptics noted the absence of overt mass graves, the odd preservation of personal effects, and the possibility that the villagers had been persuaded voluntarily to participate in some collective rite meant to protect future generations. Psychologists, when consulted in the late 20th century, pointed to group dynamics under stress. Charismatic leadership, isolation, and millenarian thinking can produce consensual acts that, to outsiders, appear as coercion. At the heart of the debate remained a figure whose contradictions refused to settle into villain or savior, Reverend Elias Fenn. In his published homilies he preached compassion. In his private letters he plotted containment. To some he was a pastor, determined to save his flock from a perceived contagion. To others, a zealot who rationalized atrocity. The Order of the Veil's documents suggested he had powerful allies willing to sanction radical measures. The archaeological ring, with its burned center and scattered bones, suggested those measures, whatever their intent, had become irreversible. The more investigators probed, the more they found that every conclusion opened into another question. Who supplied the sulfur and pigments traced to the textiles? Which magistrate signed away parish documents? Whose hand redacted names from wills? The historical evidence was a mosaic of acts, some deliberate, some defensive, each tile reflecting a different motive: fear, greed, belief, and the brutal human calculus of survival. And yet, even with these shards assembled, the most unsettling revelation was still to come. Something buried in the very center of the ring an object that would force historians to choose between interpretations and would reshape the narrative from one of social cruelty to one of desperate, possibly rational, containment. To find it would require opening a cavity sealed since April of 1722 and reading what lay beneath the ash. In the dimly lit room of the Old English archives, the historian Thomas Gray sat motionless, the last surviving page of the Street Hollen register trembling in his hand. The final line read, in faint sepia ink, "And so we close the gates, to seal the voice beneath." The words didn't belong to Father Abner. They were signed by someone else, the village's magistrate, Elias Ward. Until that moment, no one had even known Elias survived the supposed plague, but that signature changed everything. It was the clue that cracked the case wide open, the missing voice in a centuries-long silence. When Gray traced the handwriting, it matched a confession found separately in an estate ledger outside of Kent, a confession written by Ward himself before his disappearance. It turned out the plague wasn't a disease at all. The villagers of Street Holland had faked the outbreak, isolating themselves deliberately. The symptoms, seizures, bloody eyes, delirium, were real, but not from illness. They were the side effects of something far more sinister, a ritual experiment gone wrong. The Order of the Pale Veil, which Gray had dismissed as a mere rumor, wasn't a visiting sect. It was founded within Street Holland. A group of village leaders, priests, and scholars had secretly believed that beneath the village lay a burial site, an ancient Roman catacomb that held relics capable of granting the voice of the dead. They'd been trying to summon the lost knowledge of the Roman dead, specifically an oracle named Cassia Vara, who was executed for blasphemy in the 2nd century. To awaken her, they needed a sacrifice that wasn't willing, a mind that could be forced open. Father Abner's sermons about God's children hearing his voice were never spiritual. They were coded justifications for human experiments using the villagers themselves. The plague was the cover. The symptoms, the screams, the disappearances, all orchestrated. And when the ritual worked, when something answered, it wasn't divine, it was her. According to Elias Ward's confession, one stormy night in 1722, they gathered in the church cellar. 12 of them, including Father Abner, knelt around a stone circle carved into the earth. The walls were painted with Latin inscriptions, but not prayers. They were instructions. Each villager held a relic, a coin, a bone, a vial of Roman dust. And in the center of the circle lay a young woman, one of the townsfolk's daughters, a girl named Mara Ellens, the final vessel. They began chanting a mixture of Old Latin and something unrecorded. Ward wrote that the air itself turned heavy. The candles burned blue and the ground trembled. Then the girl began to scream, not in agony, but in other voices. Every time she screamed, it wasn't her own words they heard. It was an ancient Roman dialect. The dead were speaking through her. Then silence. When the echoes faded, the 12 were left blind for several minutes. When they regained their sight, the girl was gone. The center of the circle was blackened. And Father Abner smiled. Ward's confession stated, "Is greater than," he whispered, "she has become the vessel of Vara. The dead will walk again among us." By dawn, the villagers began to die, one by one, their blood dark, their skin cold, and their eyes wide open, unblinking even in death. Those who survived tried to flee, but Abner ordered the gates locked. He told them the dead within the earth must not leave, not even through the living. That was the moment Ward decided to betray the priest. He and a few others tried to burn the church, to erase all evidence of what had been done. But the flames refused to catch. The wood was damp with something slick, black, and cold. By morning, the priest and every remaining villager were gone. No bodies, just the lingering scent of rot and ash. Father Abner's motive wasn't madness. It was obsession. Records found later in his quarters revealed his past as a scholar of forbidden theology in Paris, expelled in 1709 for communion with the profane sciences. He believed death was a door, not an end, and that if mankind could speak to those beyond, we could erase the errors of time. In his journals, he wrote of his dream, a world when knowledge was eternal, when no truth was ever lost. But his methods, the blood medium ritual, required possession, not prayer. He had convinced the villagers that the ritual would protect them from disease, that the sacrifice was for their salvation. But in truth, he wanted to merge with the oracle, to channel her consciousness into his own. And perhaps in a way he succeeded. Ward's final words in his confession read, "Is greater than." His eyes were not his own. When he looked at me, I saw her staring back. That line became the basis for the Abna-Vara convergence theory, the idea that the priest and the oracle became one entity. When Gray read those words aloud in 1989, he felt the air in the archive drop to near freezing. The recording equipment captured a faint whisper, an impossible voice layered under his own. "We are still here." When Gray's findings were published under the title The Street Hollen Inquiry, it sparked international fascination and dread. News outlets called it Britain's hidden village, while skeptics dismissed it as hysteria. But when excavation began in 1991, archaeologists uncovered 13 unmarked graves, exactly where the confession described. 12 adult skeletons and one smaller set of bones, fused into the soil in an unnatural posture, the skull fractured as if from within. In the center of the remains, they found a stone tablet etched with the Latin words, "Vocem audimus," we hear the voice. The discovery made headlines worldwide, then, just as quickly, disappeared. The excavation site was abruptly closed by local authorities due to safety concerns. Within a month, the records vanished from the British Museum archive. Gray died less than a year later. His cause of death, asphyxiation. The last recording from his study captured him whispering, "Is greater than, it's not a story, it's waiting." Gray's daughter Evelyn spent years trying to clear her father's name, claiming he was silenced for uncovering something the church feared. She published her father's notes online, but within weeks, the files were taken down for copyright infringement. Local families who discovered they were descendants of Street Holland villagers faced ridicule. Some even changed their names. Others spoke privately of nightmares, the same recurring image of a woman with hollow eyes whispering through fog. They said she never spoke words, just breathed, listening. Today, Street Holland's remains lie beneath layers of grass and roots, officially designated as an unmarked conservation site. No new constructions are allowed. Even drone footage in the area has been mysteriously distorted. Every attempt to map the terrain produces digital noise that looks eerily like faces. In recent years, locals in Kent have reported hearing faint, rhythmic sounds near the site, a cadence, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing beneath the ground. Some claim the earth still breathes there. Others say it's just the wind. But every few decades, someone disappears near that field. No official plaque marks Street Holland. No mention exists in tourist maps. But if you search long enough, you'll find coordinates online posted anonymously. Those who visit speak of an uncanny silence, where even birds refuse to sing. And if you kneel by the ruined church wall, you might still see the faint carvings under the moss, Latin words, barely visible in the stone. Vocem audimus. We hear the voice. Maybe Elias Ward was right. Maybe they did seal something beneath. But if so, the question isn't whether it's still trapped. It's whether we're the ones who opened the door again. Beat of silence. Wind grows louder. Why do some truths remain buried? And if the dead still whisper, are we sure we want to listen? This story unsettled you. If it made you wonder what else history has chosen to forget, you know what to do. Subscribe to Dark History HD, where we uncover the shadows time tried to erase. Like this video, share it with someone who thinks history is just dates and dust. And remind them, not everything that's buried stays dead.